Hello and welcome. This is Jim Karp with Raymond along with Don McAnally. Don, how are you today?
Things are great, Jim. Hope you're doing well, too.
I am. There's a lot going on these days, especially when we're dealing with the PPP loans. Information's moving quickly. There's a lot of misinformation that's out there. Lots of questions coming in on the reimbursement of payroll cost and the 8-week period. Can you shed some light on those matters for us?
You know, Jim, there's so much questions out there with clients. Everyone's really trying to figure this whole thing out. On the good side, the SBA sent out some regulations and a forgiveness application last Friday, May 16th. This application came out and it helped provide some guidance to us. And it begins the process of really answering some questions. Within the act, Jim, there was some provisions called incurred and paid expenses. In order to be forgivable, to be allowable, they had to be incurred and paid during the 8-week coverage period. That was really leaving a lot of questions out there. Exactly what did that mean? How are clients going to incur and pay payroll expenses within an 8-week period? 8-week period, excuse me. You know, most businesses pay every 2 weeks. They usually end, let's say, on a Friday, and then they pay the following Friday, Jim. So that was really causing some issues. Got some good news here. The regulations that came out last week established an alternative payroll coverage period. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really important, Jim. And the reason it's important is that it allows for a flexible date relative to the forgiveness of only the payroll costs. So I think probably anyone who's listening probably knows that the forgiveness period was supposed to begin on the date the business received their money from the bank. So the date of deposit is when the 8-week period was supposed to start. That's when the clock started. Okay. With these new regulations, it really helped us out here. What it did is it gave us a flexible start date. Okay. And it gave an example. I'm going to read the example. It says if the borrower received its PPP loan proceeds on Monday, April 20th, and the first day of its first pay period following its PPP loan disbursement is Sunday, April 26th. The first day of the alternate payroll covered period is April 26th, and the last day of the alternative payroll covered period is Saturday, June 20th. So I think what this is really good, Jim, is that clients aren't going to have to adjust their pre-established payroll periods, okay? They're going to be able to start this 8-week clock ticking relative to payroll only on the next regularly scheduled payroll period. So I think this is a really good thing for clients. I think it'll help them to simplify this whole matter.
And you know, with all the complexity that's out there, I know a lot of people were talking about defining what a full-time equivalent is. Is it 30 hours? Is it 40 hours? And they're constantly coming out with updates on that. Where do we stand as that is today?
You know, Jim, that's a really interesting one. You know, the concept of a full-time equivalent came out several times within this article, or within this act, excuse me, and there really wasn't any sort of definition of what constituted an FTE. And so it left many of us to only guess where the regulations were going to end up at. And we thought it was going to be a 30-hour work week is what was going to constitute an FTE. They clarified this a little bit, and they came out saying that a full-time equivalent is someone that works 40 hours a week, at least 40 hours, Jim. So that means if you're working more than 40, you can't double up on that. You can't work 80 and say you're a 2 FTE. Nope. Once you clip over 40, you become a full FTE, and you're a 1 no matter how much time you work. There is another interesting aspect that we found within the act, and it really helps to simplify the calculations of the FTE. We had a lot of clients that were concerned, you know, if my employee works 23 out of 40 hours a week, you know, are they 23 40ths? If they work 30 out of 40, they're, you know, 0.75. What they basically said here is that anyone who works less than a full-time equivalent is going to be a 0.5 FTE. It's a simplified method that they put out there.
Okay.
Jim, I think this makes things tremendously easier for our clients. So at the start, when they're calculating FTEs at the look back period, if someone works less than full-time, they're a half-time equivalent. If they work full-time, they're 1 FTE. And at the end, when we're in the coverage period, you can do both. You can have the same counting methodology, either 1 FTE or 0.5 if they work less than 40. I think it'll simplify things a lot for clients.
Awesome. And then also you're saying on the high end too, if they're working 60 hours a week, there's still 1 full-time equivalent. Okay. That makes sense.
Correct.
Don, there's been a lot out there in regards to reduction calculations. Now, this is dealing with associates and offering them work, a good faith offer for them to come back. Maybe they're terminated or they have a voluntary request to not come back, and that changes the calculation. Can you shed some light on that topic?
Jim, it's interesting. This has probably been these last 2 months, we continue to have such significant dialogue with our clients on so many different issues. And this is a question that really comes up with some great frequency here right now, is that, employees are a little bit scared to come back to work. And it's understandable. Employees have certain situations, perhaps maybe their children who traditionally are at school or daycare aren't able to have those places for the children to be at. So the employees are having to stay at home. Okay. Perhaps maybe you had an employee that, is on a maternity leave or had a baby and decided not to come back, or an employee who was separated and they voluntarily terminated their employment, or maybe it was involuntarily terminated. Not everything works out cleanly. And so, Jim, we're getting a lot of calls from clients on this matter, and it really gets down to the legality of the situation. We've had dialogues with attorneys on these things, and the regulations within the Act kind of speak to this as well. And I think there's some good news within the Act, and it kind of simplifies things in a lot of ways. First off, it's the employee that doesn't come back to work. Okay, so you've given them a bona fide offer to come back to work. Remember, Jim, that needs to be in writing. We're advising clients to make sure that they send a written notice to come back to work. And for whatever reason, the employee decides to not come back to work. So in the look back period, let's say they were a full-time equivalent. They worked for you full-time, but now they don't want to come back to work. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Clients were concerned, is that going to harm me in my reduction calculation? They were an FTE before, and they're no longer an FTE. Oh no, I've dropped one full FTE. Regulations say you're going to be okay. You don't have to count them in the look back period, and you're not going to count them in your coverage period. So that's good. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Also, employees who have voluntarily separated, those that have just decided that they no longer wanted to continue to work, that happens. Those that were involuntarily separated, you may have had an employee that you had to terminate, unfortunately, let's say at close to the end of Q1. So they wouldn't have been working for you during the coverage period as well because you terminated them. You don't have to include them as well. So I think there's been some kind of liberalization of the rules here that helps make it easier for employers to calculate these types of things, especially in these special circumstances that really are going to impact basically every employer. Life happens.
Don, I'm hearing a lot about concerns in regards to loan proceeds for the payroll to achieve forgiveness. Now, some people say 75%, depending upon where the funds are spent. Can you give us some clarification on how we can spend those funds?
Jim, this is a really interesting question. You're right. There's a lot of confusion out there right now. I think that, the whole process, the whole loan application, the whole loan determination process came upon us pretty quick by design. I think the federal government wanted to act very quickly to get money in the hands of small businesses. And I think they accomplished that. But sometimes when you hurry things through a little bit, you miss a lot. We've all heard the saying, Jim, haste makes waste, right? Where your grandma would tell you that. Don't do things in a hurry like that. And I think sometimes as I reflect upon this act, I think things were done kind of in a hurried fashion. And I think we're going to find a lot of recipients of this loan being surprised as to how much of the loan is not really going to be forgiven for them. And I think that, a lot of them are strategizing how they can most effectively and efficiently use the loan proceeds. And one of the things that we took when we initially read the act was that you had to spend 75% of the proceeds on payroll. That seemed to make some sense. Okay. Let's use an example, Jim. It's always easier to talk in example format. Let's say your practice got $100,000 loan. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us read the plain language of the law, the act, to say that you had to spend 75% on payroll. Okay. So $75,000 had to be spent on payroll. The remaining $25,000 could be spent on rent, utilities, the other things that were forgivable and allowable under the act. Okay. What we're finding right now as we talk to our clients, whether it's because they're in a shelter-in-place environment, whether it's because the governor has not allowed their practice to open, Jim, is there's concern about how am I going to use the $100,000? How am I going to use $75,000 on my staff payroll when my staff's not even there? Okay. But they're still going to have rent costs. They're still going to have utility costs. Okay. So there were some people out there that were discussing the act that were saying you had to spend 75% of the proceeds on payroll. Okay. Jim, to be honest with you, I never saw that within the act. Never really thought that that's the way it was going to be. And I'm happy to tell you that the new regulations that came out with the forgiveness applications added some clarity to this. And I think the reasonable side again won out on this. And what it basically said was what a lot of us were thinking too, is that your eligible payroll costs, whatever they sum up to be, that is the 75% floor that you will then judge the remaining 25%. So Jim, let's say, continue on with the example. A business got a $100,000 loan. And let's say that they only spent $60,000 on these eligible payroll costs. Well, a 75-25 split is basically a 3-to-1 split. So if they only spent 60,000 on payroll to maintain the 3-to-1 split, they would have to spend $20,000 is what they would have remaining to spend on utilities and rent. So that would bring their total spend up to $80,000. So it's pretty straightforward, Jim, but I think it helps to clarify a question that was out there. There's a lot of people that were very concerned that if they didn't spend the 75% or 75,000 for my previous example, that the whole loan was non-forgivable. That just doesn't make sense, Jim. I mean, the whole purpose of the act was to help reseed these businesses with working capital so that they could operate in a post-pandemic environment.
Okay, so you've taken the complexity out of that then. So I, as a business owner, can then understand in very simple terms that based on that, the intent behind the act and how I can spend the funds. Okay, great.
Exactly.
Don, we spent a lot of time focusing in on payroll as there's a lot of questions on that, but I'm also hearing a lot of questions about utility costs. What qualifies, what doesn't qualify? Can you share with us your thoughts on how we should manage our utility costs?
Hey, Jim, that's a good point. In these types of discussions, we do tend to talk quite a bit about payroll costs, and it's probably reasonable that we do that. That's 75% of the forgivable cost. But you're right. We've got 25% that we can't ignore in this whole process, and a big chunk of that are really the utility costs right there. So this is something that I think business owners, practitioners have to be aware of, and there was a little clarification in the loan forgiveness application in the new act, and it gave some definition around utilities as to what it meant and what it potentially didn't mean. I think probably the next few ones are going to be things that we would all think of when we think of utilities: electricity, water, natural gas. Interestingly enough, Jim, it mentions transportation. Okay. I think a lot of us think those mean fuel costs. Okay. So while not overly applicable to medical practices, there are some instances where providers are going in between offices and such. So they could, possibly look at gasoline costs involved in transportation. Telephone and internet access are two other utility costs there that I think you can look at. By telephone, Jim, you might be thinking, cell phone in today's day and age, right? Unfortunately, it doesn't say cell phone. It basically says your landline, the hard landline that's coming into your office there. So it's a little bit different, not what we were hoping for. We thought maybe that they would allow cell phones as part of that. Jim, it could change. We've seen a lot of flexibility, a lot of liquidity, a lot of movement in this act. So that could change. Stay tuned to that. Some things to be aware of. The act says that you have to have these services in place prior to February 15th. Jim, we get a lot of calls from clients that are, eager to maximize their forgiveness. And one of the things I have to make sure we tell them is that, hey, the act says these have to be in place. They had to have been in place pre-pandemic, which is set at February 15th. Okay. So you'll want to make sure that you can kind of make that case when you're going through the forgiveness application cycle, really with your banker. I think your banker is going to be the one that's going to be key throughout this whole process. And do yourself a favor right now. Make sure that you're maintaining copies of all these forgivable costs. And you might want to make copies of, say, your utility bills for January and February. Now, Jim, you might be wondering, why is he asking me to make copies of those bills in a pre-forgiveness period environment? That doesn't really matter. I'm not going to get those costs forgiven. But note what it can really impact is it can really make the case that these utilities were in service prior to February 15th. And I think that that's really important, Jim, is to make sure that you can state the case that everything was in place prior to February 15th. I know we've got a number of people from all over the country that listen in on these webinars, Jim, and there's been some question out there about other types of costs that you can include in here. Could you include, cable costs, lawn maintenance, or trash pickup. Right now, Jim, the act doesn't appear to allow those costs. So some people think that, boy, my trash service, my dumpster pickup should be included. It's not included in it right now.
Okay, so Don, just for a quick clarification, so I own a business, and I do not want to try to pull in any cost that did not exist before February 15th. So in your example with the utilities, if I didn't have utilities before February 15th and I can't prove it, then I should not plan on expensing that as part of the forgiveness.
That's a great question, Jim, and I don't think you will be able to get that included in your forgiveness period here.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. Don, we've talked just now about utilities, of what we can and most likely cannot expense as a utility. A lot of it deals with timing. And so there's terminology called paid and incurred, and there are different aspects of it. Can you clarify for us the timing of those and how it impacts our ability to expense these costs?
You know, Jim, it's kind of strange how two words can cause so much confusion within the act. You know, there's a lot of questions out there. We're constantly being asked questions from clients about, what does this paid and incurred mean? How does it impact me? And the regulations provided a little bit more clarification. What it basically says is you can't count the same payment twice. Okay, so then that left some confusion too. In the area of rent costs, let's use that as an example, Jim. Getting a lot of clients that'll call me and they'll say, can I use this money to pay my February rent? Can I use this money to pay my April rent? And we're helping them understand that internally, it really doesn't matter to us what month you allocate this rent to. If internally you say this was my March's rent and this is my April's rent, all they want to make sure is that they've reimbursed you for 2 months worth of rent, 2 months worth of utilities. I've had people say to me, hey, can I charge my February and March electrical bill to this grant? Okay, Jim, they're going to be looking at coverage periods right now. Okay, so no, you can't bring in those old bills and try to sneak them in there. They're going to be looking at coverage periods as well. So going back to my rent example, they're going to be looking back to cover 8 weeks worth of rent. Okay, and if you got a lease agreement that says it's $10,000 a month, and you got 2 rent payments, they're going to reimburse you for 2 rent payments. Now, internally, if you call those for a different month, hey, that's your business, okay? They're reimbursing you for 2 months rent, and they're going to reimburse you for during that forgiveness period. So I think they've added some more clarity, but Jim, there's some questions out there. The devil's going to get into the details here, and we're all just going to have to figure it out together to see what's reimbursable and forgivable under the grant.
Okay, Don, we've covered a lot of territory here today. There's probably several other things that are best practices that we should be aware of. Can you share some of them with us?
Jim, I guess what I want to talk about to answer that question, I had the discussion with you, is something that came out within the regulations that kind of surprised us. And I think that this might be something that will surprise some people listening to this as well. We were all aware that payroll costs for those making over $100,000 a year were capped, right, Jim? You just couldn't allocate huge levels of payroll. The government wasn't going to pay for anything more than $100,000 worth of annual salary. So, Jim, it was basically taking $100,000, dividing it by 52 weeks, and multiplying it by 8, which comes out to be $15,385. Okay. So, but under the plain language of the law, payroll costs, you'll remember, was included more than just W-2 wages, right? Included, health insurance costs, dental, vision, plus qualified plan costs, a profit sharing plan. And so when we did the loan calculations, we included all of those costs. The SBA sent out some Q&As that said that you could include all of those costs in the determination of your loan proceeds. Okay. But so far, they've kind of thrown us a curveball with this one right here. And there is some verbiage within the forgiveness application that's really quite interesting here, Jim. And what it goes through to say is that it says the payroll cost for employee owners, okay? Employee owners, self-employed individuals, and general partners. The read on this is that with the guidance that we're receiving is that this $100,000 cap is not only the cap for W-2 wages, okay, but it's also the cap, your combination of W-2 plus health insurance plus profit sharing plan. So, Jim, in the past, when we looked at this and we said, okay, you can have, 8 weeks worth of wages, that's 15,385. We thought that you could have, 2 months worth of health insurance. Let's just say that's $3,000. So that's another 3,000 onto that. Now we're up to 18,385. And we thought that you could have 850 seconds of a retirement plan contribution. Okay. So maybe we thought that was going to be, $3,000 or $4,000 that we could have for a high income, physician or dentist. Okay. So we were thinking that we were going to have, I don't know, $23,000, $24,000 worth of forgiveness that we could have from the grant for people with compensation over $100,000.
Okay.
Jim, these regulations kind of surprised us, and not in a good way. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What they're limiting the combination of all those three costs for anyone making over $100,000 at the $15,385 level. Jim, This is significant right here. This is a significant reduction in the amount of money that can be forgiven with this. This is something really that all practitioners, all providers need to be made aware of, and a general reason why you really need to get with your Raymond advisor to make sure that you fully understand the magnitude of the forgiveness that you can have under this act. This is going to change it, Jim. It's going to reduce the forgiveness.
Don, as time has rolled on, and we've done several of these, and I know you've talked to other people as well, and there's constant updates on a daily basis. It really sounds like that for the next couple months, it's still going to be very fluid. And it's even more important to make sure that you're interacting with your business advisor team. And when I say team, it's not only looking at your CPA, but making sure that you surround yourself with the right people with the correct answers that really have the pulse on it. And I sincerely appreciate all your efforts that you're doing because I know that you're out there reading this stuff every day, and that's key.
Thanks, Jim. There's a lot of fatigue out there right now. Many of us have been cooped up in our houses for the better part of 2 months, afraid to leave the house to go to the grocery store to buy gasoline or to do anything here. And so I get it. A lot of practitioners are getting tired of this situation, and it's difficult, but we need to make sure that we focus right now to bring this act through to its conclusion. Hate to tell you, Jim, we got several more weeks that we've all got to manage this, and we're going to look back upon this, and we're either going to look back upon it with the best eyes that we can to say, hey, we managed it the best we could, or we're going to have frustration with it. And, a thing that I often tell clients is make sure you've got documentation with everything you do. We're not going to go to the banker for forgiveness and throw a shoebox at them and say, hey, good luck, you sort it out. That's not the way it's going to work. We go there with that type of attitude, we're going to have nothing forgiven with this loan, Jim. I'm advising clients, we're all advising clients to make sure that your documentation is maintained, to make sure that your documentation is very orderly, to make sure that you bring it to your banker with everything tied out in a bow. We don't need any scrutiny. We don't need any red flags on your file. We want to make sure that this process runs as smoothly as possible because we all need to get through this together.
And part of that's being prepared in advance and tuning in and making sure you got the right information. Thanks for your time, Don. We'll talk soon.
Appreciate talking with you, Jim. Best of luck.
Take care.